Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So today we're looking at Surah Hadid from our recitations from today, which is the 57th chapter, verse number 16. So anyone who wants to pull it up, Surah Hadid, Al-Hadid, which is number 57, and the verse is number 16. This is an important verse in the Quran. This verse is Allah's wake-up call to the believers. This verse is meant to wake us up, to push us, to reprimand us, to scold us. For those of us who believe, but we're slacking in faith. Our practice might not be up to the standard expected of believers, or our iman might be very superficial, but it's not inspiring us to be who we're supposed to be. So Allah sends this verse to wake us up, to remind us. Abdullah ibn Masud, he said this verse was sent or revealed down to us after 4 years, after we became Muslim, to remind us, to wake us up, to push us. Ibn Abbas says, he has a different opinion, he says it was revealed 13 years after the start of the revelation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلُ فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Allah says, is it not time? Isn't it time for believers that their hearts should tremble, should feel humble at the remembrance of Allah and the truth that has been revealed? So isn't it time for you to wake up and your hearts to be humble before the remembrance of Allah and before the revelation that comes down? Then Allah says, do not be like those who were given revelation before you, whose hearts were hardened with the passage of time. فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ. With the passage of time, their hearts became hard. قَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ فَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. And many of them became transgressors. So this verse speaks of this natural state of iman. Why was this verse revealed? Because iman is fluid. Iman is something that goes up and down. And it's natural that after some time, when time passes, your heart becomes complacent, becomes hard. And that's a natural thing. It happened to the previous nations. It happened to a small extent with the companions. So Allah revealed this verse to remind some of the companions who, not all of them, but of course some of them, whose standard of faith and practice might not have been up to the standard. So Allah says, wake up. Isn't it time now? Isn't it about time? And it's a reprimand. Although it's a reprimand, it's full of mercy and tenderness and love. Allah is saying, isn't it time now for you believers who believe in Allah, who believe in my revelation, for your hearts to now to move, to change, to inspire you to action. And don't be like those previous nations who, with the passage of time, their hearts became hardened. And these previous nations, the previous faith traditions, like the Jews and the Christians, what happened after time passed? They had great prophets, great revelation. But with the passage of time, their hearts became hard. They started corrupting the revelation. They started changing the priorities of their faith. They started introducing new teachings into their religion. And eventually, the end result, their faith became a corrupted version of the original, very different from the original. The prophets came with Tawheed, the faiths became filled with shirk, worshipping other than Allah. The prophets came to remind them to wake up and connect with Allah Azza wa Jal. Their faith became legalistic and about loopholes and just superficial practice and nothing to do with the hearts. So Allah warns us not to fall into the same traps. There's much that we can learn from this verse. It's a beautiful verse. It's a verse that inspired many people over time. Many of the companions, like Ibn Umar, when he used to recite this verse, he would begin crying. Many of the great heroes of our tradition, the great Salaf, some of the greatest figures, Their story of coming to Islam had to do with this one verse. We know this famous story of Fudayl ibn Iyad. He was a highway robber. Although he was born Muslim, but he was someone who was very violent. He had a band of robbers around him. And they would rob caravans and people would be afraid of him. And his story is one day he was doing his usual deeds and he heard someone reciting. He was on top of a wall looking for victims. And he heard this recitation of this verse somewhere. And somehow he just thought about it. It struck his heart. And then he heard at the same time, so he heard this verse, isn't it time for believers that their hearts should melt at the remembrance of Allah? And then he came down and he was thinking about it and he heard some people warning, hiding in the darkness of the night saying, oh, Fudayl might be here because he was so notorious. And then he realized in that moment he made tawbah and he became a great Muslim. He's one of the great figures of our tradition. He's widely quoted in Hadith, in Quran, and Tafsir. He changed his life around. Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, another great Muslim, changed his life around reading this verse. So this is something that we should think about. If the companions, after the passage of time, they needed to be reminded, what about us? The passage of 1400 years. How many Muslims today that profess to believe, but then they read the verses, but it doesn't really change their actions. It doesn't change how they behave. It doesn't change our societies. It doesn't change how we live. And that really is a problem. That means these verses are not really affecting us here. So the verses are supposed to affect us. The verse is supposed to move you. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ. Allah says believers are those when Allah's verses are recited, their hearts tremble, their hearts are affected, and they are inspired. So this is very, very important. And at the end, Allah says, فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. What we learn from here is that with the passage of time, it's a natural thing for the hearts to become, less vibrant, and maybe even qasa. Qasiyat qulubuhum means hardened hearts. They come to a level where nothing affects you anymore. You become hardened. You become jaded. And that's a danger of the passage of time. And the problem with that is, when your hearts become hard, what does Allah say? وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. That leads to wrong actions. Fisq is when you transgress against the limits of Allah. Where does it start from? From the hardening of the hearts. So these hearts become hardened, then it affects your actions. But at the end there's hope. The next verse, what does Allah say? اعلموا أن الله يحيي الأرض بعد موتها قد بينا لكم الآيات لعلكم تعقلون. No, you should know this, that Allah revives the earth after it has been dead. This is the season we're in spring right now. If you go down the streets, look at all the trees. Now they're pink and the beginnings of vegetation. This season of spring is upon us. Just a month ago, a few weeks ago, all these trees were dead. There was not a single green leaf. So this is Allah's sign. Allah mentioned this sign. Just so you see the earth, it dies and it's barren, and Allah brings it back to life. Why does He share this right after this verse? To give us hope that, look, your hearts could become hard. They might even die, but they can come back to life with the remembrance of Allah. The solution is to read the Quran, remember Allah's verses, think about them, understand them, and let them affect your heart. May Allah make us among those whose hearts are soft with the remembrance of Allah, not those whose hearts are hard. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ وَسَلَّمَ عَلَى نَبِيِّنَا مُحَمَّدٍ وَعَلَى آلِهِ وَصَحْبِهِ وَسَلَّمَ.